Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the misty cobblestone streets of 19th century Paris, where the gas lamps flicker, top hats bob through the evening crowds, and somewhere nearby, someone is gently tugging on a silk leash attached to a frog. Yes, a real frog, not a statue, not a child's toy, not some whimsical metaphor. A squishy, blink slowly, web-footed frog, waddling its little green legs beside a proud Parisian in patent leather boots. You're not hallucinating. You haven't drifted into some absinthe-induced fever dream. This was very real, very fashionable, and frankly, very confusing. As you follow the pair, woman and frog, you start noticing more of them. A plump toad with a lace ruffle collar. A dainty tree frog on a tiny leash of braided gold thread. One of them even rides in a velvet-lined walnut shell on wheels. No one blinks an eye. In fact, people smile. You probably won't survive this century's trend cycle. And really, why should you? People once thought leashed frogs were the next evolution in chic urban living. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'm always curious who's up wandering the world with me this late. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge gently through the lamplit gloom, past taverns with swinging wooden signs, your boots slick with damp from the Seine's breath. It's the 1860s. Paris hums with artistic revolution, casual absurdity, and an undercurrent of bored opulence. The kind of place where a man might keep a frog not for food or science or fairy tales, but because he's tired of parrots, his cat hates him, and the goldfish lacks panache. Nobody's quite sure who started it. Some say it was a theater performer from Montmartre who first walked a frog down the Rue Lepic to advertise his comedic act, La Grenouille Bourgeoise. Others swear it began as a drunken dare at a café on Rue Mouffetard. Someone lashed a bootlace to a garden toad, and the thing waddled straight toward a policeman's shoes. A round of laughter, a glass smashed, a trend born. Historians still argue whether the craze began as satire or genuine affection, but what's clear is this. Sometime between 1855 and 1870, frogs became more than just pond pests. They became companions, statement pieces, a way to say, I don't need a poodle to be fascinating. You pass a lady in an emerald cape. She doesn't look at you. Her gaze is fixed on the tiny white frog in her gloved hands. It blinks. She whispers to it. This name you overhear is Monsieur Pamplemousse. You try not to laugh. You fail. That's okay. Paris is laughing too. Gently, indulgently, like it's in on the joke, but also a little enamored. Frogs don't demand attention. They don't bark or meow or try to bite the mailman. They just exist, damply, with a sort of existential dignity that only 19th century Parisians could find noble. The shops begin to reflect the shift. A boulangerie now offers brioche grenouille, shaped like little squatting toads. A tailor down the alley begins advertising frog leash holsters as a hands-free way to promenade your amphibian without risking your gloves. You pause near a toy store window. Inside, a display of miniature chaise lounges designed for frogs, complete with tassels. A sign in the window reads, Pour vos compagnons les plus distingués. For your most distinguished companions. Of course. And here's the best part. No one seemed to think this was all that weird. Oh, the British did. The British thought it was hilarious. Their newspapers printed sketches of frogs drinking absinthe, frogs in corsets, frogs dueling with toothpicks. The French have lost their marbles, declared one cartoon in Punch. But within France, it was just Tuesday. You spot a pair of schoolboys leading a cane toad on a string through a puddle. They've drawn a mustache on it in charcoal. A nearby gendarme chuckles, gives them a wink. This is a city with priorities. Sure, revolution simmers just beneath the surface, and yes, the working class is rioting again somewhere near the Bastille. But here, in this square, a frog wearing a tiny bicorn hat is definitely the star of the moment. You wonder, what did the frogs think of all this? That's one question no one wrote down, sadly, but some signs suggest they were well pampered, carried in velvet pouches, spritzed with mist from imported atomizers. One particularly deranged or enlightened aristocrat allegedly commissioned a custom chaise longue for his bullfrog, complete with miniature reading glasses perched on its squat little face. According to local gossip, the frog never read a page. But it looked intellectual, and that was the point. Quaint frog salons begin to spring up. One offered tiny mud baths and a harpist playing Debussy. Another claimed it could decode your frog's mood aura based on its croak pitch, which, for legal reasons, they probably just guessed. Meanwhile, scientific journals, feeling left out, tried to capitalize on the craze. One wrote a very serious 11-page essay titled "The Psychological Resonance of Amphibian Companionship Among Parisian Youth." Historians still argue whether this was satire or sincere. Still walking, you pass a fountain where lovers used to meet. Now, it's been repurposed. Small platforms have been installed along the rim. Little frog diving boards. You see 3 leashed frogs hopping along the edge, their owners cheering softly. One of them does a surprisingly elegant belly flop. Applause follows, from a crowd of 7 humans and 1 parrot. The parrot is unimpressed. By the end of the decade, frog leash walking wasn't just a trend. It was a minor civic phenomenon. And like all good Parisian trends, it had tiers. There were your casual frog walkers, students, flaneurs, aging poets. Then came the enhanced leashers, who added flair with matching accessories. And finally, the elite Grenoilists, the frog purists who believed each frog had a spiritual alignment and should only be walked under specific moon phases. You laugh. Surely no one went that far? They did. In fact, one noted astrologer published a guide, Lunar Amphibian Wellness, a Parisian codex. He claimed that walking a red-eyed tree frog during a waning crescent would bring artistic inspiration and shinier boots. His pamphlets sold out. As you sit now, watching a couple share wine on a bench with their frogs perched nearby like bored little emperors, you realize the whole city is in on it. Frogs weren't just pets, they were participants. Accessories. Tiny, rib-biting mirrors of French extravagance and silliness. And perhaps a bit of rebellion, too. Because what better way to mock the rigidity of class, the monotony of etiquette, the endless crush of respectable life, than by strolling the boulevards with a frog on a leash, daring the world to say something. You turn the corner, your boots now quieter on the smoother stones of Rue de Rivoli, and there, beneath the awning of a boutique that once sold silk gloves, you find them. For well-dressed women, seated in a half-circle of rattan chairs, each with a frog resting calmly in her lap. One of the frogs is wearing a tiny red ribbon tied around its belly like a sash. Another has what appears to be a miniature cravat. A third wears nothing at all but stares with the measured patience of a creature used to being admired. They're not chatting about politics or husbands or even literature. They're talking about posture, frog posture. One insists her frog is a little too hunched, that it may be a result of bad carriage habits. Another swears she's hired a specialist to correct it. You watch, fascinated, as she lifts her frog gently and demonstrates a motion that resembles a yoga stretch. The others nod in approval. This is not performance art. This is Tuesday tea. By the 1860s, upper and middle-class Parisians were saturated with trends. From crinolines to charades, salon culture to indoor fern gardens, they had tried it all. And slowly, the novelty was wearing thin. What, after all, was left to explore? Enter the frog. It offered something new. Something gloriously unexpected. Not too wild, snakes were gauche. Not too smelly, geese were difficult. And not too common, cats were everywhere. A frog was just strange enough to excite the imagination without violating the boundaries of polite society. At least not at first. You pass a pamphlet stuck under a lamppost, La Société des Amis des Amphibians, the Society of Friends of Amphibians. Beneath the flowery script is a charcoal sketch of a toad reclining on a fainting couch. In your time, this would have gone viral. In their time, it sold out weekly. Some members met in salons once a month to sip elderflower wine and discuss their frogs' diets. Did yours prefer endive to lettuce? Would a sprinkle of lavender encourage better sleep? One woman allegedly had her maid roast insects in clarified butter to coax her frog's appetite. "He won't eat if they're too crunchy," she explained. Frogs, it turned out, made a perfect canvas for bored bourgeois imagination. And the bourgeoisie were very bored. This was a Paris recovering from revolutions, unsure what to do with its nervous energy. The elite needed to distinguish themselves, and their behaviors, however absurd, became tiny rebellions against monotony. Some flaunted it with politics, others with exotic pets. Frogs, oddly enough, became the perfect compromise, neither threatening nor mundane. A banker's daughter was spotted in the Bois de Boulogne, walking her leopard-spotted frog in an embroidered bonnet. When asked why, she simply replied, "Because no one else is doing it." That, perhaps, was the entire ethos. Even the fashion world caught on. Tiny frog accessories emerged: leather leashes, frog-sized parasols, even custom-fitted rain boots for amphibians with sensitive feet. One boutique claimed their boots were hand-stitched from ethically sourced eel leather, which, let's be honest, sounds like something Gwyneth Paltrow would market today. There were critics, of course. Always are. A stern-faced columnist in Le Figaro called it the slow degradation of Parisian dignity, one croak at a time. He urged city officials to ban frog promenading in public gardens, warning of moral decline through slippery companions. The mayor declined to respond, perhaps too busy trying to evict a pigeon from his office. The backlash didn't stop the trend. If anything, it helped, because what's more Parisian than a bit of defiance? You weren't just walking a frog anymore. You were challenging social norms. Gently, elegantly, with croaking. The artistic community naturally had a field day. Painters began including frogs in portraiture. One self-portrait featured the artist reclining nude with a frog on his shoulder, a riveting muse. The critics didn't know what to do with it. Was it satire? Seduction? Self-mockery? Historians still argue whether the piece was brilliant or simply uncomfortable to look at in polite company. Back on the street, you pass a small child holding a frog like a prize. His mother scolds him. Not because he's holding a frog, but because his shirt doesn't match the frog's leash. Priorities, people. Soon, competitions begin to appear. Not for racing, no. That would be too uncouth. These were contests of elegance. Le promenade parfait, the perfect walk. Judges scored on leash color, frog calmness, coordination between human and amphibian. There were categories for best dressed frog, most graceful leap, and even most thoughtful expression while sitting on a stone. A modest trophy was awarded, a bronze lily pad atop a walnut base. Winners had their frogs' names etched on a plaque. One legendary frog named Thibaut Ledoux won 3 years in a row. He reportedly died peacefully while sunning himself in a pastry box. Meanwhile, cafes began installing frog-friendly areas. Some provided tiny bowls of dew water. Others built raised cushions for frogs to sit alongside their humans. At Café Grenouille, frogs sat on coasters while their owners sipped espresso and discussed politics. One man claimed his frog croaked each time someone mentioned Napoleon. Skeptics insisted it was coincidence. Believers whispered, reincarnation. And in the salons, frogs became conversation starters. Do you leash yours with hemp or silk? Mine only responds to piano music. Have you tried frogs from Burgundy? Their temperament is delightfully melancholic. It was part mockery, part sincerity. The lines blurred, much like Parisians themselves, forever waltzing the razor's edge between performance and conviction. But there were whispers, too. Rumors that some people didn't walk frogs at all, but switched them out for mechanical replicas to avoid the smell. One artisan was rumored to craft clockwork frogs that blinked and croaked on cue. The church frowned on this, of course. They always frowned, but the trend only grew. One evening, a preacher even delivered a sermon titled, "The Folly of Frogs, Vanity in an Age of Collapse." He compared the amphibian craze to the fall of Rome, said the leashed frogs were harbingers of the end. The crowd applauded politely and walked home with their frogs in their coat pockets. You keep walking, past a cobbler offering tiny frog slippers, past a bookstore selling fables de Grenouille's modernes. past a tailor fitting a frog-sized vest with silver buttons. Everything feels vaguely surreal, slightly damp, very French, and yet, beneath the absurdity, there's a strange kind of beauty to it all. Frogs, those creatures of mud and marsh, elevated to silk and society, given names, given dignity, given love, however misplaced. After all, isn't that what the bourgeoisie were looking for? Not just amusement, but something soft to hold, something living to make them feel less dead inside. A little green pulse in a city of gray routines. So you pause by the river, sit on a cold bench and listen to the faint croaks echoing across Paris, to the splash of tiny webbed feet, to the laughter of people who, for once, let themselves be ridiculous. You wake up, well, not really. You're still here, wandering gently, drifting through the damp perfume of Paris in its amphibian age. Morning light is stretching across the cobbled streets now, peeling through the fog like a silk scarf, and you're headed toward one of the most unexpected hotbeds of frog fancy, the Jardin des Plantes. You wouldn't expect a formal botanical garden and zoological park to be the epicenter of a cultural ribbit, but here we are. Originally intended as a center for scientific inquiry and imperial floral showboating, the Jardin had slowly morphed into something else entirely by the mid-19th century. A place where respectability and absurdity held hands, strolled arm in arm, and occasionally paused to coo at a frog in a bonnet. You walk through the ornate gates, wrought iron twining into lilies and lions, and feel a low hum beneath your feet. Not spiritual, not magical, just frogs. Lots and lots of frogs. Somewhere between the orangery and the primrose beds, you hear it. A delicate metallic bell. You turn. A man in a top hat is walking a leopard-patterned frog wearing a small copper bell on its collar. The frog waddles dutifully, as if attending a board meeting. You can't look away. This, you soon discover, is race day. Yes, frog races, and not the kind your rural cousin used to host in the backyard mud. These are official, timed, cheered for, wagered on, sometimes, though not legally, of course. The Jardin's racetrack is modest. Just a strip of raked gravel beside the water lilies, hemmed by velvet ropes and lined with folding chairs. The frogs start on one end, their handlers behind them, coaxing them forward with soft words, finger snaps, and sometimes the wafting scent of crushed flies in tiny gauze sachets. Because naturally, the crowd is eclectic. Ladies in lace gloves, students scribbling bets in notebooks, a few bored aristocrats fanning themselves under parasols, and one man with a monocle who is probably named Gaston, though no one checks. The bell rings again, and 6 frogs, green, brown, one suspiciously blue, are gently placed at the starting line. And they're off, sort of. One immediately hops in the wrong direction. Another seems to reconsider everything and sits down. A third flops dramatically onto its side like a tiny amphibian tragedian. The crowd gasps, murmurs, applauds anyway. Historians still argue whether these races were purely entertainment or an attempt at social satire. The slow, directionless progress of the frogs, leashed yet free, pampered yet aimless, may have mirrored Parisian society in ways that made people uncomfortably reflective. But mostly it was for fun. In a city that often took itself far too seriously, watching a frog take 20 minutes to travel 2 meters while wearing a top hat offered a kind of comic relief no opera could rival. As you wander deeper into the gardens, you spot frog enclosures that have evolved far beyond science. Once utilitarian, they now mimic Versailles on a miniature scale. Tiny hedgerows, gold-accented lily pad pools, even a miniature gazebo for private frog moments. And, get this, some frogs have names painted on plaques beside their tanks. One reads, Duchesse de Cuismal, soft-thigh Duchess, fond of beetles, prefers Vivaldi to Chopin. You lean closer. She blinks slowly. You whisper bonjour. She does not care. Back then, even the scientists got in on the absurdity. The naturalists who worked at the Jardin des Plantes were caught between 2 conflicting duties: rigorous zoological study and massive public interest in frogs behaving like people. So, ever adaptable, they began holding public demonstrations. Not lectures, no, spectacles. You once again follow the crowd to a domed conservatory where a white-coated researcher introduces the behavioral nuances of urban amphibians, while two frogs sit at a miniature dining table before them. One is offered a sugar cube, the other a damp crouton. The point? No one remembers, but the frogs were very well behaved. Later, you see a small exhibition titled Costumes Historiques pour Amphibians. Historical costumes for amphibians. The display includes a Napoleonic frog outfit, complete with epaulets, a Marie Antoinette wig that's at least 90% cotton balls, and something labeled Gothic Revival Frog, which looks suspiciously like someone glued lace onto a prune. And yet, it's charming, deeply, wonderfully charming. There's something disarming about it all, something quietly radical. The Paris of the 1800s was still processing revolutions, industrialization, and shifting gender roles. Frogs were, in some twisted way, a relief valve. They asked nothing. They judged no one. They wore whatever you wanted and never complained about your bad poetry. One whispered legend tells of a frog named Victor, adopted by a lonely widower who claimed the frog restored his soul. Each morning, Victor was placed on a saucer near the window and serenaded with a violin. The neighbors thought the old man had lost his mind, until they noticed Victor croaking along to certain notes. They came to listen. One woman wept. A new legend was born. Of course, there were naysayers. There always are. Some biologists raised concerns about the frog's health. Urban noise, overstimulation, diets high in opera snacks. Others worried about dignity. Shouldn't a zoological garden focus on preservation, not parody? But the public wasn't interested in dignity. They were interested in frogs wearing cummerbunds. And so, the Jardin des Plantes became less a symbol of imperial science and more a living theater. A place where a tired teacher could drink lemonade while watching a frog pirouette awkwardly on a piano key. By mid-decade, the garden even opened a tiny frog cafe. Official name Café Vert. Frogs weren't allowed on tables, of course. That would be uncouth. But each table did come with a small ceramic lily pad bowl where frogs could rest while their humans enjoyed a croissant and the latest satirical newsprint. You sit there now at one of those tables, swirling a ghostly espresso in a cup that no longer exists. A woman beside you lifts her frog carefully and tucks it into a knitted sleeve. "He gets cold afternoon," she explains softly. You believe her, so you watch, you listen. The faint splash of a frog leaping into a shaded pond. The hushed voices of schoolchildren laughing at a frog that refuses to move. The chirp of birds above and the eternal, patient stare of a toad named Claude who might, just might, be judging your fashion choices. Paris at this moment is quiet. A soft green dream tucked between science and silliness. A city that, for once, doesn't need to conquer or analyze or seduce. It just needs to croak. You're heading east now, away from the murmuring hedges of the Jardin des Plantes, where frogs nap like royalty in the shade. The streets narrow as you go, closer walls, echoing footsteps, little windows watching you with a sleepy sort of interest. It's quieter here, quieter, until you hear the polite tinkle of a small silver bell behind a yellow door. You pause, and that's when you see it. A plaque that reads, Académie de Savoir Frog. Instruction pour amphibians et compagnons. Frog Etiquette School. Of course. The door opens, and out walks a woman in pearl gray gloves carrying a wooden box. Inside, nestled on satin, is a green frog with a monocle strapped gently to its head. The monocle is crooked. The frog is unbothered. You're beginning to suspect that frogs have known the secrets of calm dignity for far longer than humans have. But yes, here we are, frog etiquette lessons. You tiptoe inside. The parlor smells faintly of tea and pond water. A chalkboard stands to one side with neat diagrams of proper frog posture. A small harp plays softly in the background, live, played by a girl in a mint green dress. At the front of the room, a man with a curled mustache and an expression of determined seriousness claps his hands. Mess Amos, he says, addressing the room of 6 frogs and their equally intent owners. We begin again. From the curtsy. That's your cue to sit, quietly, on a velvet bench with springs that squeak under your coat. He demonstrates with a model, a plush frog stitched with joints and ribbons, one hand behind his back, the other guiding the plush's little legs into a dainty bend. "This," he says, "is the curtsy of a frog with dignity, a frog of noblesse." The woman next to you whispers, "Last week, one of them learned how to nod." Now, etiquette school wasn't originally a thing for frogs. Of course it wasn't. It started with wealthy pet owners training their dogs and parrots to behave in salons. But somewhere between the racing frogs and the cafe-sipping frogs, the inevitable happened. People started asking, "Can my frog learn?" And not just tricks. Anyone can teach a frog to jump on command. No, these were lessons in civility. Holding still during tea, not licking porcelain, remaining perfectly composed when seated on a chaise longue during an art critique. You wonder, were the frogs actually learning, or were the people just projecting? Historians still argue whether these etiquette schools were ever effective or simply symbolic. But either way, they became real. Some were small and charming, like this one. Others were grand, high-vaulted drawing rooms with embroidered lily-pad carpets and little formal diplomas printed in gold ink. There was even a supposed frog finishing school in Montparnasse, where your frog could graduate avec honneur after a 10-week program. The curriculum, a delightful mix of real science, hopeful dreams, and absolute nonsense. Week 1, the composed sit. Week 2, leash acclimatization and sidewalk decorum. Week 3, indoor conduct and appropriate croak volume. Week 4, reacting to opera without upstaging the soprano. Week 5, mirror etiquette, no jumping at own reflection. Week 6, silent judging used to great effect at salons. Week 7, traveling in carriages without panic. Week 8, responding to toasts with a bow. Week 9, cross-class encounters, behaving around toads. Week 10, graduation gala rehearsal. Some schools claimed their graduates could sit through entire dinner parties without fidgeting. One former pupil allegedly winked at a duchess. She swooned. Her husband was not amused. At this particular academy, you watch a live demonstration. A rotund green frog, affectionately called Maître Beignet, is placed atop a red silk cushion. A servant clinks a spoon against a teacup. The frog sits still, unmoving, serene. The room applauds. The instructor puffs with pride. "Notice the restraint," he says. "Not a flinch, not a twitch. That, my dear guests, is a master of self." You lean forward, tempted to whisper, "Or he's just asleep." The woman next to you hears your thoughts. "Hush," she says. "They feel everything." You decide not to test the theory. Etiquette frogs, it seems, weren't just about status, they were about hope. If a frog, born of mud and flies, could learn to fit into the sparkling world of Parisian civility, then maybe anyone could. There was something oddly democratic about it. Some of the most respected frog students didn't come from noble swamps or designer tanks. They were street frogs, gutter-found and gently rehabilitated, polished until their skin glistened like varnished stone. It made people feel good, rescuing the humble, turning the lowly into the luminous. Of course, it also made people feel superior. This was still Paris, after all. You pass into the adjoining room, the salon of frog accessories. Here, soft music plays. A white-gloved attendant holds up samples. Miniature fans for dramatic frogs. Embroidered cushions for resting between applause. Even scented collars, a controversial invention, banned in some districts after it was discovered that too much rose oil made frogs dizzy. And yes, the infamous velvet harnesses. These were often custom-fitted, with lace trims and adjustable clasps. One model is designed to resemble a military sash. Another is embroidered with the Latin phrase silentium estate gracile. Silence is graceful. By now, your brain is folding in on itself. It's one thing to watch someone walk a frog. It's another to realize that people were investing emotion, money, and deep spiritual projection into these animals. You remember reading about a salon poet, Henriette du Calvert, who claimed her frog, Malou, could sense disappointment in humans before they themselves noticed it. She would bring Malou to readings, place him in a shallow bowl on the table, and announced that any time he croaked, she would stop. "The poem," she said, "must be rewritten." Malou was a strict critic. She rewrote a lot. By the end of the 1860s, frog etiquette had leapt out of salons and into print. Pamphlets circulated, proper courtesies for the amphibian inclined, a lady's guide to dignified frog ownership, and the ever-popular "Do Frogs Dream of Polite Company?" Satirists had a field day. One cartoon in Le Chivalry showed a frog perched on a chair beside a goblet of wine, waving away a toad with a cane. The caption read, "No manners, no table. Go leap elsewhere." And yet, beneath the jokes, the movement marched on. You exit the academy as the bells chime. Another etiquette class begins inside. Today's focus? Emotional restraint during thunderstorms. Outside, two gentlemen pass you with a frog dressed in a waistcoat of blue velvet. The frog yawns. One man says, "He's been so well behaved lately." You nod, because of course he has. You look back at the academy one last time. Its shutters now partly drawn, its sign glinting softly in the sun. A place where frogs became students and people truly believed, that grace could be taught to anything. And maybe they weren't entirely wrong. The sun has begun to droop behind the rooftops, casting long, theatrical shadows across the Parisian streets. The city feels warm now, less from heat, more from the collective exhalation of a day well spent. But you're heading downhill toward the Quartier Latin, and as the shadows stretch, so too does your curiosity. Where did the rest of Paris stand on all this frog-leashing business? You won't have to wonder long. You reach a narrow alley where laughter echoes between brick and shutter. A puppet show is in progress, and not the refined, government-funded kind. This is street satire, rowdy, brilliant, and unapologetically amphibious. At the center of a hastily built wooden stage, two puppet frogs argue. One wears a ridiculous powdered wig, the other a monocle and sash. Their voices, pitched and squeaky, shout about rent, baguettes, and which one deserves a seat in the Académie Française. The crowd howls. Someone throws a radish. You realize this is the other side of the frog trend, because not all Parisians walked frogs in parks or attended amphibian etiquette school. Some, especially the working class, watched with bemused disbelief as the upper crust paraded frogs around like trophies. And, as always, they turned that disbelief into biting humor. What had started as high society novelty trickled into parody. Broadsheets began printing frog-themed satire. One featured a fake classified ad, "Lost. One emotionally unstable toad. Answers to your grace. May attack opera critics." Another painted frogs as political metaphors. A sketch titled "The Marsh Cabinet" depicted frogs in cravats debating how to tax dragonflies. One wore Napoleon's hat. A bold move. Historians still argue whether these lower-class jabs reflected genuine disdain or just Paris's eternal appetite for lampooning literally everything. But one thing's for sure, the frogs became a class symbol. You pass by a group of students from the École des Beaux-Arts staging a mock frog funeral. They march solemnly down the street with a stuffed toad in a tiny coffin. One of them reads a poem titled "Elegy for a Noble Croaker." Another drinks wine directly from the bottle and mumbles, "This is for Thibaut." A woman leans out a window to shout, "Your frog owes me rent." The procession bows and keeps walking. It's absurd, obviously, but also oddly poignant, because in a city full of invisible walls, between rich and poor, men and women, art and reality, a frog on a leash was a conversation, a spark, a reason to laugh or scoff or whisper, "What are we doing with ourselves?" One satirical paper even launched a faux political movement called La République de Grenouilles, the Frog Republic. Their slogan, "Jump forward, not backward." It was nonsense, and yet, a surprising number of people wore frog pins for several months. Some took it further. You wander into a dingy tavern with creaking floorboards and a smell that could politely be described as age, cheese, and regret. On the wall hangs a mural of frogs leading a protest. One holds a sign that says, "Flies for all." The bartender, a wiry woman with a tattoo of a lily pad on her forearm, smirks. "We don't walk frogs here. she says. We listen to them. You pause. They talk. No, she shrugs, pouring a cloudy glass of something vaguely herbal. But you can learn a lot watching things that don't pretend to be human. She points to a corner where a live frog sits in a glass bowl next to a candle and a half-written poem. That's Jean-Luc. He's our muse. Of course he is. Not far from here, down the Rue du Chat Capechi, a shadow theater performs every Friday night. And for a while, maybe 2-3 seasons, every play starred frogs. They weren't real, obviously. These were paper cutouts. But the stories were unmistakably drawn from the absurdities of Parisian life. Frog meets frog. Frog gets rich. Frog forgets humble roots. Frog is eaten by social expectations and also possibly a heron. The message was clear. Frogs had become more than pets. They were a mirror, a joke, a critique wrapped in a croak. Not everyone appreciated it. Some of the elite, especially those with actual leashed frogs, felt attacked. One baroness reportedly tried to sue a puppet troupe for slandering her toad. The judge, wisely, dismissed the case, though added, "It is indeed a slippery matter." Others leaned in. A playwright named Marcel Dumas wrote a full-length tragedy titled Les Jams Mollies, The Wet Legs, in which a noblewoman falls in love with a talking frog only to discover he is her ex-husband in amphibian form. It received mixed reviews but excellent ticket sales. You can't make this up. Except that someone already did. On street corners, you hear street singers belting out frog-themed ballads. Oh, croaky love, you left me in the pond slash, with silk leash trailing and heart far gone. One accordion player does a parody of an opera aria, ending every line with an exaggerated ribbit. The crowd erupts with laughter. A man tips his hat, and someone tosses a coin onto the pavement. Even children got involved. Paper dolls of famous frogs hit toy stalls. Maître Beignet, Duchesse de Cuismal, and a rebel frog named Jacques Le Sauterelle who refused to wear anything except a single red boot. His slogan, "Freedom leaps." Parents grumbled. Kids begged. Toy makers smiled. And yet, despite the mockery, maybe even because of it, the frog trend endured. Because parody is still attention, still energy, still a croak in the conversation. And for working-class Parisians, it offered something rare. A chance to laugh at the elite without getting arrested. A harmless, silly, ridiculous way to say, "We see you, and also, your frog is wearing a bow tie, and that's hilarious." You sit now on a low wall near the Seine. The sky above turning that peculiar velvet blue that only Paris seems to do well. Someone walks by with a frog tucked inside their coat. Someone else sings a lullaby that includes the phrase, "Bless my green-footed soul." You smile, because you get it now. The frog was never just a frog. It was a blank slate, a mirror, a meme before memes. And whether you were rich or poor, drunk or dreaming, you could look at a frog on a leash and say, "That's ridiculous," or "That's beautiful," or "That's me," and on the best of nights, all three. You move through the twilight now, your boots striking softly against the cobbles as the city exhales into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere nearby, someone is lighting a gas lamp. Somewhere else, a violin slips into a minor key, and across the rooftops, the first stars blink on, indifferent, elegant, very Parisian in their aloofness. You follow the Rue Saint-Honoré and take a quiet left down an alley so narrow you wonder if it was designed more for cats than humans. And at the end of it, a wrought iron gate with a carved frog at the apex. Glass eyes, smug little grin, tailcoat engraved in the metal. This is it, Blue Circle Amphibian, the elite frog owners club. Unlike the street puppeteers or the etiquette schools or the ridiculous salons with lace-trimmed lily pads, this place is different. Quieter, wealthier, more selective. The kind of club where you don't ask to join, you get invited, or inherited, or bribed in with something that croaks and comes with royal lineage. The concierge, wearing what appears to be a frog-shaped lapel pin and an expression of polite exhaustion, lets you in. You step into a world of mahogany paneling, gold-accented sconces, and whispered conversation. The air smells like cigars, lavender, and ambition. And yes, there are frogs. But not just any frogs. These are pedigree frogs. Bred, documented, displayed in glass-top terraria like jewels. Some trace their lineage back to Louis XV's private garden. Others were allegedly descended from frogs who lived near Descartes estate. Thinking frogs, one member jokes, you walk past a sideboard stacked with charts, genealogies of amphibian lineages, complete with watercolor portraits. A bullfrog with an impressively square jaw is listed as Duc de Verdant IV, keeper of the noble ribbit. The name is written in looping calligraphy. You suppress a laugh. Mostly, here frogs are not mere pets. They are legacy, status, a way to whisper to the room, I'm not just rich, I'm culturally amphibious. You pass a sitting room where members sip brandy and speak in hushed tones about the Calais line or the disgraceful interbreeding scandal of '68, which apparently involved a common garden toad and a courtesan's pet named Clementine. Historians still argue whether this scandal ever occurred, or if it was an elaborate in-joke among bored aristocrats, but the records exist. Or at least a beautifully illustrated pamphlet does. You spot a silver-framed certificate on the wall. It reads, Certificat de Noblesse Batrachienne, Certificate of Amphibian Nobility, a real thing, issued after careful inspection, lineage tracing, and, get this, a behavioral assessment by a council of 3 frogvaliers. You linger by a glass case containing notable artifacts. A tiny coronet meant for a frog of royal designation. A violin made of hair-thin reeds supposedly played to soothe anxious amphibians before formal events. And a locket, within which sits a dried toad said to have been carried through 3 duels. He never blinked once, the label says. Well, of course he didn't. This is the height of the absurdity now. Not just having a pet frog. Not walking it. Not dressing it. Not racing or critiquing poetry or teaching it how to curtsy. This is full-blown, institutionalized frog aristocracy. You take a seat near the fireplace where a man in a brocade waistcoat is reading aloud from a book titled La Dignité Amphibienne. Essays sur le silence et le sel, The Dignity of Amphibians. Essays on silence and salt. No one interrupts. Even the frogs seem to be listening. A nearby table hosts a game, frog whist. Similar to regular whist, but instead of cards, players use painted stones with amphibian symbols. Each has a meaning, apparently. Wisdom, agility, serenity, punctuality. The winner earns a carved ivory lily pad and the right to pick dessert. And dessert? Oh, it's not for you. It's for the frogs. A bell rings, and a butler in white gloves arrives with a tray of what look like raindrops. Glistening and perfect. Dew jellies. Formed from chilled floral nectar and placed on leaves of gold foil. Members offer them to their frogs like sacrifices to tiny gods. One woman whispers to hers, "You deserve it, darling. You didn't flinch when Gaston spilled wine." Her frog does not respond. He does not need to. It's easy to scoff at all this. You should scoff. These are grown adults giving silent toasts to frogs. But you can't help feeling a weird admiration. They committed, fully, absolutely, without apology. And in some ways, isn't that Paris at its core? Take a ridiculous idea, obsess over it, wrap it in silk and philosophy, add brandy, call it culture. Not everyone was thrilled, of course. Newspapers rolled their eyes. Critics of the circle called it a swamp of delusion. One radical pamphlet described it as aristocracy reduced to its most literal form, cold-blooded, bug-eyed, and incapable of empathy. But inside these walls, none of that mattered. Because for those who belonged, the frogs were more than pets. They were extensions of self, quiet confidants, living jewelry, symbols of everything too subtle, too strange, or too slimy for polite society to acknowledge, unless you dressed it in velvet and gave it a title. You leave the circle with a head full of contradictions. Outside, Paris yawns and stretches into night. Someone passes you humming a lullaby about a frog who goes to war and returns a philosopher. A couple walks hand in hand, a frog perched serenely in the woman's handbag. You realize this whole thing, this leashed frog phenomenon, isn't just some odd Parisian footnote. It's a world where frogs held up mirrors to human absurdity, elegance, longing. A world where people found meaning in the unlikeliest of creatures. A world built not on reason but imagination. And really, what's more Parisian than that? Paris at night is a different creature, velvety, slower, but no less curious. Gas lamps cast warm halos on slick stone streets, and the hum of the city lowers to a cozy purr. Somewhere in the distance, a train moans. Somewhere closer, someone laughs. Alone. You move with that hum now, a gentle ghost passing through this sleepy kaleidoscope of whimsy and shadow. Tonight, you're headed underground, because you've heard whispers, odd ones, about an entire subterranean frog cabaret tucked into the old limestone hollows of Montmartre. A place for the artists, the fringe thinkers, the lost poets. Not the rich, not the satirical, not the refined. This is where the weird went to breathe. You descend a narrow staircase beneath a flower shop, past wilting lilies and a cage of moths. There's no sign, just a knock, one, then three, and a sliding panel. Pair of eyes. A pause. Then, do you croak? You blink. Yes. The door creaks open. Welcome to Le Saut Noir, the Black Leap. You're met with thick candlelight, mismatched chairs, and red velvet drapes that look like they've seen one revolution too many. The ceiling is low, the air smells of smoke, absinthe and moss, and the stage. Oh, the stage is barely raised but pulsing with anticipation. A man with a beard like wild seafoam shuffles past carrying a frog in a silk satchel. A woman in a corset laced with ivy strums a lyre made from bones and lacquered wood. Her frog rests on the soundboard like a paperweight with opinions. Le Saut Noir is not a place of order. It's a theater of maybes. And tonight's program? A cabaret of amphibian-infused anarchy. First up, a mime act featuring two frogs and a street performer who reenacts the story of Orpheus. Except Eurydice is played by a toad in a lace shawl and a suspicious amount of glitter. He pantomimes the descent into Hades. The frog hops. The crowd snaps their fingers. Next, a spoken word performance. A woman in black silk, pale as moonlight, recites a free verse poem titled, "I loved a frog once, and he never left me." The frog beside her blinks slowly, maybe in agreement, maybe in boredom. It's impossible to tell, but everyone applauds anyway. The whole place is full of these strange little pairings, humans and frogs, united by something more than ownership. Companionship? Projection? Madness? Art? You're not sure. Historians still argue whether Le Saut Noir was an actual venue or just a myth stitched together from journals, receipts, and scandalous letters. But pieces of it definitely existed. One poet described it as the place where frogs saw humanity at its most naked, which might be a metaphor, might not. The MC takes the stage now, top hat tilted, coattails frayed. He introduces himself as Monsieur Cos, which translates loosely to Mr. Ribbit. He grins like he knows a joke you haven't earned yet. Tonight, he says, we leap between truths, between what is and what could croak. And then, of course, he opens a wooden box and out hops the featured performer. A sleek, obsidian-colored frog named Mireille. She lands on a lily pad-shaped platform, and the pianist begins a delicate, haunting tune. Mireille doesn't sing. She doesn't dance. She just sits, perfectly still, staring, unflinching. It's hypnotic, absurd, beautiful. You hear someone whisper, "She knows something." Someone else replies, "She's seen the inside of time." A man near the back begins to cry quietly. You wonder briefly if you've gone mad, and yet you understand. Here, underground, in this molten pool of dreamers and misfits, the frog has become an icon of something deeper. Not just fashion, not comedy, but presence. Frogs don't pretend. They don't posture. They sit in mud and blink and wait. They are what they are. And in a society obsessed with pretension, artifice, and performance, that's revolutionary. The show continues. A musical trio performs a dirge called Croak Me Gently, accompanied by a violin, a flute, and the occasional burp from the frog in the flutist's breast pocket. No one laughs, not out loud. A painter unveils a mural titled Swamp of the Soul. The audience stares. Some nod. One man removes his shoes, for no reason at all. Even the waitstaff get in on the act. They serve drinks in lily-shaped goblets, offer napkins folded into origami frogs, and whisper phrases like, "The pond sees all," and "Mind the tadpole, madam," without cracking a smile. This isn't just nightlife. This is ritual. At the back of the room, there's a wall where patrons leave tiny letters, written in poetic scrawl or drunken scribbles, each addressed to frogs past, present, or imagined. You read a few. "Dear Pierre, you were the only one who understood the rain. To my darling Emilian, you were cold and slimy and perfect. I miss you, frog who appeared in my dreams. Please come back. I need advice. It's heartbreaking. It's hilarious. It's human." And somewhere in that flickering candlelight, amid the croaks and chords and whispered nonsense, you begin to see the outline of something true. That this frog obsession wasn't just a trend. It was a bomb, a rebellion, a way for a city cracking under its own brilliance to look into the eyes of something small and silent and say, "Stay, just stay with me." Because a frog doesn't ask questions. It doesn't betray. It doesn't change its opinion halfway through a debate. It just is. And sometimes that's enough. You stay late, later than you should. The candles shrink into stubs. The wine tastes more like pond water. Someone is reading a love letter to a frog named Michel. You cry a little. You laugh a little more. Eventually, the room thins out. The frogs get tucked back into velvet pouches or carried gently under arms. Monsieur Coase bows and vanishes into a mist of rose-scented smoke. You climb the stairs into the soft Parisian night, your ears full of jazz and croaks and strange poetry. You're not the same. None of them are. And now, neither are you. The next morning rolls in slowly, like a foggy thought you're trying to remember. The air smells like fresh bread, yesterday's rain, and a faint trace of tobacco smoke curling from a balcony somewhere overhead. Paris blinks herself awake, but you're still floating between frog cabarets and satin leashes. You wander north, through Montmartre's crooked streets, past shuttered ateliers and café tables stacked like tired sentinels. And as you walk, you notice something odd: frog graffiti. Subtle at first. A spray-painted silhouette on a brick wall. A sticker of a frog wearing sunglasses with the phrase, "Ribbit Resistance," scrawled beneath. Then a mosaic, laid into a stairwell, of a frog raising a tiny protest sign. And finally, a massive mural. A regal frog, crowned in gold, lounging atop a crumbling government building. Welcome to the quiet rebellion. Because while leashed frogs strutted through upper-class gardens, and etiquette academies trained amphibians for ballroom civility, not everyone was so enchanted. A small but vocal movement, part political, part absurdist, part who even knows anymore, rose up to ask, "What are we actually doing here?" You duck into a smoky cafe, the kind that smells like ink and overthink. Someone hands you a leaflet, unprompted. The cover? A frog lounging on a guillotine, smirking. The title? Un Nation Enchaînée. Are we all the frogs? Inside, a bizarre essay that reads like half philosophy, half slam poetry. They walk them in circles. We walk ourselves in circles. Who? Then, where's the leash? Okay, so they're not exactly subtle. These were the anti-frogists, a loose collective of writers, radicals, and disillusioned flaneurs who saw the entire frog obsession as a symptom of France's cultural unraveling. According to them, every frog on a leash was a metaphor for a person trapped in a system that applauded absurdity and called it elegance. They weren't exactly wrong. One pamphlet asked, if a frog can earn a title and a cushion, why not the seamstress with cracked hands? Another suggested replacing all government officials with toads, since they already sit and blink through decisions. That one got quoted at dinner parties for weeks. Historians still argue whether these rebels were serious or just satirizing the satire. But their influence spread. Their symbol? The upside-down frog. A crude sketch, legs up, tongue out, sometimes excess for eyes. It popped up on alley walls, bathroom stalls, even the occasional newspaper margin. They hosted unwalks, gatherings where people brought their frogs and refused to leash them. The frogs sat defiantly on cafe tables, bathed in crumbs and quiet protest. No one moved. No one spoke. It was more performance art than political statement, but in Paris, those were the same thing. One cafe owner, sympathetic to the cause, began naming pastries after anti-frog slogans. You sit at his cafe now, watching passers-by with the weariness of someone who's seen too many croaks to take anything at face value anymore. On the menu, Le Liberté Leg, a long croissant shaped like a frog limb. Tarte de la mer, filled with bitter greens and existential despair. Croque madame, which is just a regular croque madame but with googly eyes on top. You order all three. Why not? Beside you, a student sketches a caricature of a frog in a powdered wig, labeled Duke of Distractions. His friend mutters, "It's all frogs now. Nothing but frogs." You don't disagree. And yet, even within rebellion, there was contradiction. Some anti-frogists kept frogs anyway. Quietly, privately, they said things like, "He's not like the others," or "Mine represents the end of meaning." Sure he does. Others joined purely for fashion. One man at a protest wore a coat with 42 frog pins. "I'm here ironically," he said, as his toad pooped on his pocket square. Still others claimed frogs were being exploited, that the real issue wasn't the human projection, it was the amphibians' lack of consent. They held rallies called Croak for Freedom. The frogs did not croak, but the sentiment was noted. You pass a bookshop selling fanzines with titles like Les Marais Sans Fatigues, The Swamps Are Tired, and Frogs Ate My Taxes. Inside, the owner, glasses, mustache, one earring, waves you over. He places a book in your hand. A worn paperback with a frog on the cover, walking away from a city in flames. "No one reads this anymore," he says. But it knew what was coming. The story? Post-frog Paris. Empty cafes. Unleashed madness. A society that gave frogs everything and forgot itself. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. You leave the shop and notice a small protest forming near the riverbanks. A group of artists, each holding a sign with increasingly unhinged slogans. "Frogs can't fix capitalism. Let them leap where they will. I am my own amphibian." And the most confusing, "No pond, no peace." They chant softly, rhythmically, like monks in a marsh. And in the middle of it all, sitting calmly on a cobblestone, is a real frog. No leash, no crown, no monocle, just there, watching. You crouch down beside it. It blinks. You blink. For a second, nothing moves. The protest fades into background murmur. The river hisses. A breeze slides by, and you realize something deeply unsettling. This frog has no idea what's happening. None of them ever did. All the titles, the satire, the velvet capes, the whispered toasts, just people playing dress-up with nature, projecting, performing, and pretending it all meant something. And maybe it did, but not to the frogs. You stand and walk away slowly, the little amphibian fading behind you like a dream. The anti-frogists weren't trying to stop frogs. They were trying to stop us. From turning joy into performance. From letting whimsy become power. From believing that absurdity, wrapped in enough silk, became truth. But it's too late, really. The frogs are everywhere now. Literal and symbolic. Wild and leashed. Mocked and worshipped. And Paris, bless her dramatic soul, wouldn't have it any other way. Late afternoon drapes itself over Paris like a worn velvet curtain. Golden light brushing the shutters and chimneys in that way you only ever see in Impressionist paintings. Or the kind of dreams where you somehow know you're in Paris without anyone ever saying it. You stroll without aim now, your mind thick with croaks, cravats, and quiet existential dread. And that's when you hear it, the hum of commerce. Because, of course, when frogs became fashion, someone had to monetize it. You follow the sound to an open plaza where a line of market stalls glows in the dwindling light. This isn't your average fish and apricots sort of market. No, this is a frog marketplace, bustling with vendors selling everything the 19th century Parisian frog lover could desire, and several things no one ever needed. It's called Le Marché Patrician, the amphibian market. You approach the first stall, stacked with rows of tiny boots. Yes, boots. For frogs, waterproof, the merchant assures you, wiggling one dramatically. Imported from Belgium. The leather is made from tulip bulbs and regret. You're not sure if he's joking. To your left, a rack of bespoke frog wigs, made from genuine opera house hair clippings, dyed, curled, and mounted on little cork heads for display. There's even a Mozart edition, complete with powdered curls and a silk ribbon. A woman browsing next to you sighs. He's been bald for months. I just want him to feel confident again. Across the lane, a tent labeled Le Mode Amphibienne draws a crowd. Inside, frogs are being fitted for custom garments, coats, vests, even tiny cummerbunds for formal dinner appearances. A tailor with a pin cushion strapped to his forearm takes measurements with solemn dedication. Hold still, Jacques, he whispers to a portly green frog. Breathe, darling. Imagine you are on a lily pad in the moonlight. You pretend not to eavesdrop. Historians still argue whether Le Marché Patrician was a centralized event or a rotating collection of pop-up stalls. But records from the 1870s describe frog days, where tailors, cobblers, perfumers, and jewelers all gathered to serve Paris's elite amphibian clientele. Because naturally, you can't just own a frog. You must accessorize it. Further down, you spot a perfumier offering samples from hand-blown glass vials labeled with names like Dew Whisper, Bog Musk, and the particularly concerning Romance in Algae. The merchant insists these scents are safe for amphibian skin, citing a doctor named Dr. Froissart, a name that may or may not be real. A teenage boy tests one scent on his finger, then gently waves it near his frog's face. The frog doesn't flinch. He hates musk. The boy explains, satisfied. We're sticking with lavender. Nearby, a jeweler polishes a monocle with a hummingbird feather cloth. His table gleams with miniature accessories, amulets, brooches, even a signet ring etched with a tiny crown. This one, he says, holding up a glittering collar lined with moonstones, was commissioned for the Grand Frog of the Duc de Carcassonne. You don't know what that means, but you nod anyway. It's dazzling, absurd, slightly terrifying, but mostly dazzling. And of course, it wasn't just accessories. Entire frog-themed businesses emerged. You pass a bakery offering fly cakes, tiny sponge bites topped with sugar flies and piped meringue. For your discerning amphibian, the sign says. Beside it, a small crate of frogs sniffs the air with what could be interpreted as interest. A cafe boasts a dual menu, one side for humans, quiches, tea, espresso, the other for frogs, boiled crickets, watercress consommé, chamomile mist. One table is fully occupied by a couple and their two frogs, each frog seated on a velvet pad, eyes half closed as if bored with the ambience. Too noisy for Bernard, the woman says. He prefers Montparnasse. Then there's the bookseller. Ah yes, because your frog mustn't just look smart. It must be smart, or at least appear literate. The stall features titles like Mind Over Mud, A Frog's Guide to Inner Stillness, Croak and Let Croak, Amphibian Ethics in a Human World, The Gentle Leap, Amphibian Etiquette for the Modern Home. You flip through a few. One is entirely blank. That's intentional, says the vendor. Frogs understand things we can't. Sometimes the message is silence. Deep, but not everyone was selling snake oil or frog musk. Rather, some items were surprisingly practical, like the weather cloaks, tiny, wax-coated ponchos for rainy walks, or portable lily pads. Round, plush mats that allowed your frog to feel grounded, no matter how urban your outing. One came with built-in aromatherapy. Another vibrated softly to simulate pond ripples. At the center of the market, a ring of chalk marks the stage for public demonstrations. You catch the end of a showcase by a man with a waxed mustache and a commanding voice. He's showing off a new invention, the frogophone, a tiny device that amplifies a frog's croak into orchestral sounds. Observe, he says. He presses a button. The frog croaks. It echoes as a trumpet blast. The audience gasps. One woman faints. A small child cries, "Do it again!" And somewhere, you feel the last grip of reason slip from your hands. Because this isn't just commerce. This is theater. People weren't just buying products, they were buying identity, ritual, meaning. Every monocle, every hat, every scented collar was another brushstroke on the grand, ridiculous portrait of who they wanted to be. A man walks past, wheeling a pram filled with 3 frogs, each wearing a different newspaper hat. He nods politely. They're rehearsing for Bastille Day. You're not even surprised anymore. You sit at the fountain near the edge of the market, watching a child gently feed her frog a blueberry with tweezers. The frog stares. The child whispers, "You're perfect." And in that moment, weirdly, the frog is. The marketplace begins to pack up. Stalls fold. Lanterns dim. Vendors cart away crates of lace and linen and ceramic bowls shaped like lily pads. But you linger, notebook in your lap, head full of sequined toads and perfumed dreams. Historians often scoff at le marché patrician. They call it delirium with receipts. But somewhere between the wigs and water bowls, you start to wonder, what's more human than turning affection into industry? What's more Parisian than finding meaning in the meaningless, then selling it for 8 francs and a smile? Frogs didn't need hats. But maybe, just maybe, people needed to put hats on them. To feel creative. To feel in control. To feel, for one whimsical moment, that they could love something strange and be loved back. And really, isn't that what markets are for? The market leaves a soft ache behind, as if you've spent the day laughing a little too hard at something you can't explain. But as evening creeps back over the city and that faint smell of damp stone rises from the Seine, a new thought starts to tug at your sleeve. What happened when the frogs didn't cooperate? Because not every frog took kindly to being perfumed, or booted, or gently lowered into a gold-trimmed carriage. And not every human was willing to accept that some frogs simply preferred not to be leashed. And so begins your descent into the lesser-known, sometimes alarming, occasionally hilarious world of frog misbehavior, and the escalating lengths people went to in response. You find your way to a quiet quarter near the Jardin des Plantes, where a certain veterinarian-turned-behavioralist once set up shop. His name? Dr. Lucien de Batriel, a man whose life's work was dedicated to understanding the minds of rebellious frogs. His journals still survive, barely, and are filled with entries like, Thursday, Jacques Bullfrog, 612G, escaped again. 3rd time this week, suspect emotional sabotage. Or, Marguerite refuses to wear her morning bonnet. Displays signs of passive-aggressive croaking. This was a man who took frog rebellion very seriously. His theories varied. Some frogs, he claimed, suffered from amphibian ennui, a deep, inexplicable melancholy brought on by over-pampering. Others displayed signs of leash trauma, described as a psychological response to prolonged fashionable constraint. He even diagnosed one toad with existential vertigo, after it leapt into a wine vat and refused to come out for 5 days. Not all experts agreed with Lucien's methods. Historians still argue whether his practice was medicine, theater, or performance art wearing a stethoscope. But his waiting list, always full, because truth be told, a lot of frogs were misbehaving. Some leapt out of windows. Some refused to leap at all. One reportedly croaked so loudly at a salon recital that it drowned out a soprano's aria and earned a standing ovation. The frog did not bow. Elite circles began whispering of the bad frogs. You overhear a pair of gentlemen debating it over café creme. It's the inbreeding, I tell you. Nonsense. It's the diet. Too many flies make them arrogant. Some blamed the vendors. Those hat makers, one woman hissed. They don't understand frog dignity. Others blamed the poets, claiming their emotionally overwrought recitals had made the frogs dramatic. Whatever the reason, frog tantrums became an epidemic. There were escape attempts at the Circle Amphibian, one involving a trio of frogs who made it to the roof via a velvet curtain and were found hours later on a nearby gargoyle, staring down like little green revolutionaries. One particularly bold toad named Pascal became famous for interrupting a mayor's speech by leaping directly onto the podium, peeing, and then vaulting into the fountain with what could only be described as flair. He was never recaptured. Some newspapers began printing amphibian incidents alongside regular crime reports. Frog bites finger at dinner party. Host blames perfume. Toad vandalizes miniature library. Books unreadable. Local frog refuses to attend christening. Priest offended. It got bad enough that certain shops began advertising frog obedience classes. Flyers popped up offering behavioral consultation, gentle leash introduction, and even croak translation services. You attend a class out of sheer curiosity. The instructor, a wiry man in suspenders and a vest full of bug stickers, welcomes you to the leap within. His teaching style is part yoga, part mime, part cult. The frogs are lined up on tiny meditation cushions. There's incense. There's a lot of humming. At one point he says, "To control the frog, you must first become the frog." Then he crouches, blinks slowly, and says nothing for a full minute. A woman in the back murmurs, "I think I get it." You don't, but you're still impressed. And somewhere in this surreal world of tantrums and training wheels, the frogs gained yet another role, that of symbolic wildness. Because maybe the frogs were misbehaving because they were tired of the pageantry. Or maybe they were simply frogs. Real frogs, with instincts, with unpredictability, with absolutely zero interest in debutante balls or embroidered bibs. A few radical thinkers began to argue that frog misbehavior wasn't a problem, it was a statement. A philosopher named Danton Beaulieu wrote a widely ignored essay called Against the Ribbon, Amphibians and the Rejection of Bourgeois Structure. He claimed that every refusal to leap on cue was an act of passive rebellion. When the frog does not wear the hat, he wrote, it asks, "Must I always perform for your amusement?" This line was mocked by critics but embraced by a surprising number of students, many of whom began adopting frogs not as pets, but as roommates. They posted signs that read, "My frog is not here to entertain you." They left their frogs unbothered on windowsills, wearing nothing but their own skin and an air of defiance. And in some way, the frogs seemed freer for it. You visit one such apartment. The walls are covered in charcoal sketches of a toad named Marcel. He wears no hat, no boots, no monocle. He just sits on a large damp tile in the middle of the living room. The owner, an art student named Chloe, says, "He's not my pet. He's my muse." Marcel blinks once. The radiator hisses. A pigeon thuds against the window. Marcel does not react. You've never seen anything more powerful. And yet, for every rebellious Marcel, there was always another frog being dressed, styled, staged, and sold back into the current of spectacle. Because the truth was simple, maddening, and very, very human. We wanted frogs to be people. And frogs? Frogs just wanted to be frogs. So they misbehaved. They jumped away. They croaked through poetry readings. They ruined parties. They refused couture. They reminded us, softly, slimily, with unblinking calm, that even the most absurd fantasy must eventually hit the wall of reality. That even in Paris, frogs do not wear hats forever. You head home under a sky just starting to dust itself with stars. Somewhere, a frog croaks into the silence. You hope he's doing it just to spite someone. By now, your shoes have molded to the streets of Paris, and your mind has taken on the soft, unpredictable squish of amphibian culture. What started as a curiosity has become a strange, sloshing ocean of frog banquets, frog rebellions, and frog couture. And yet, there's one piece still twitching at the edge of your thoughts. The media, because for all the poets and pet shops and powdered wigs, this frog frenzy would never have reached its fever pitch without the newspapers, magazines, and satirical prints that fed it, fanned it, and eventually drowned in it. You duck into a creaky old reading room, dusty chandeliers, rows of yellowed volumes, and a librarian who watches you like you've just tracked pond water across her floor. You settle into a velvet chair and open a battered folio marked La Gazette de Curiosites. And there it is. Frogs, frogs, frogs. The caricatures are endless. One sketch shows a frog lounging in a chaise longue, monocle askew, as servants bring it a champagne fly. Another features a group of frogs playing poker with human coins. The caption reads, "The stakes are rib biting. Pun work was particularly aggressive in this period. One publication became famous for weekly headlines like, "Frog drowns in luxury, public weeps. Fashion hops too far. Toad-in-chief appointed at Ministry of Culture." And beneath the jokes, real journalism simmered. Reporters covered frog walk of the week like red carpet events. One famous column, Leash and Leisure, reviewed the best-dressed frogs seen strolling through Parc Monceau, complete with hand-drawn illustrations. Another feature, What's in My Pond? Explored the home decor choices of elite frog owners, sometimes including interviews. One woman insisted her toad wouldn't rest unless surrounded by Monet prints. Another swore by lavender-scented pebbles and Gregorian chants. Some journalists resisted. They begged readers to focus on real issues: food shortages, political unrest, the lingering trauma of recent wars. One editor scrawled a desperate margin note: "I can't do another frog. I just can't." His article was pulled, replaced by a 2-page spread titled Frogs and the Art of Flirtation. Historians still argue whether the press stoked frog mania or simply reflected it. Either way, they amplified it, because frogs weren't just a niche story anymore. They were currency. Satirists had a field day. The great caricaturist Honoré Daumier, always one to skewer the pompous and powerful, famously illustrated a series of prints featuring politicians as amphibians. Puffed cheeks, warty faces, tiny top hats barely clinging to their heads. One minister was labeled the Grand Croaker of Commerce. These prints became so popular that fake copies flooded the streets, some with frogs giving political speeches, others lounging in parliament with bored expressions. One had a frog raising taxes on crickets, causing an imaginary riot. The real government didn't know whether to laugh or ban it. They did neither. They bought copies. Even music got in on the act. A traveling songbook titled Chansons de la Mer, Songs of the Pond, featured body frog ballads and melancholy odes. Titles included, "Why Did You Leave the Lily Pad, Ma Belle? Kiss Me Once, I Swear I'll Stay Amphibious, My Tadpole Heart." You attend a piano bar where one of these songs is still played. A young man croons with theatrical despair as a taxidermied frog gazes eternally from a bar shelf. The patrons sway. Someone sobs into a cognac. It's ridiculous, and yet you're moved, because at a certain point, satire stopped being satire. The frog, once a punchline, became a mirror. The publications evolved too. What started as satire became commentary, and what started as commentary became confession. You read an editorial titled, "I Gave My Frog My Job." It begins as a joke but descends into something oddly tender, about loneliness, identity, and wanting someone, anyone, to listen without judgment. The frog, of course, never speaks, but that's the point. Another article and signed simply reads, "The frogs have seen us. The frogs have heard our stories. And they did not leap away." There was no going back now. The media began printing self-aware headlines. "Yes, it's another frog piece. We're sorry. You're reading this. So are we the problem?" And yet they kept printing, because frogs sold. They sold. Frog memoirs began to appear. You're not kidding. Ghostwritten, obviously, but styled as first-person accounts. Titles like, "From Swamp to Society, My Leap into Parisian Fame, Memoirs of a Leashed Amphibian, All the Flies I've Loved Before." One particularly ambitious volume, Ribbit, Therefore I Am, tried to blend philosophy with frog identity. It didn't sell well, but a group of university students turned it into a play. It ran for 3 years. Meanwhile, illustrators flooded the public with serialized comics. Frogs solving mysteries, frogs in romantic dramas, frogs as stand-ins for tragic authors. Frog-themed horoscopes emerged. Pisces, your frog may try to leave you. Let it. Gemini, buy the monocle. It's time. Virgo, the croak you heard wasn't random. Listen, people believed them. You even find a small literary journal, Le Cœur Humide, The Damp Heart, devoted entirely to frog-inspired poetry. Every issue features new writers grappling with themes of silence, transformation, and amphibian stoicism. Most of it is bad. Some of it is transcendent. You read one that ends. He leapt once, not for freedom, but for distance, and I never followed. The media circus eventually choked on itself. Too many stories, too many prints, too many declarations of the final word on frog society. The public, exhausted, began tuning out. One critic dubbed it the Great Amphibian Saturation. Another called it the Long Croak Goodbye. But even as the news cycle drifted to other things, war, scandal, politics, the frogs never truly left. They'd embedded themselves too deeply in the public consciousness. And honestly, you think part of them always knew they would. The next morning starts with fog, dense, quiet, and still. It swirls low across the Seine like a secret the city hasn't quite decided to share. You walk with your hands deep in your coat pockets, listening for the telltale plop of a frog nearby. But the streets are hushed, the cobblestones slick, and for once, it feels like even Paris has stopped to take a breath. You're heading toward one of the oldest cemeteries in the city, not to chase ghosts, but to meet one of the few remaining caretakers of an almost forgotten chapter in the frog saga. His name is René, a hunched man with boots 2 sizes too large and a scarf that seems to have grown out of his beard. He waits for you beside a rusted iron gate, nodding like he already knows you've come looking for answers. You want to know, he says, where they're buried. You're confused. The people? He shakes his head. The frogs. Because yes, of course, there were funerals. You follow René through rows of tilted stones, past moss-covered angels and sunken family crypts, until he stops at a tiny, fenced garden no bigger than a tool shed. Inside, little stones, little names, little frogs. This is the Cimetière des Amphibiens Aimés, the cemetery of beloved amphibians. Started in 1876, René says, tapping the latch. Unofficial, of course. You couldn't legally bury a frog inside the city. But grief doesn't care about legality. He gestures at the stones, each lovingly etched. To Henri, who croaked only for me. Colette, leaper of hearts, not just pawns. Monsieur Jules, hat-wearer, gentleman, friend. You kneel beside one marked Beatrice, 1878 to 1879. Just 1 year. Toad, apparently. The carving is simple, but someone has placed a tiny velvet ribbon on the grave. It's fraying. The wind lifts it gently. It's easy to laugh, but you don't, because something in the silence of this place feels sincere, heavy, real. These weren't just pets, not to their owners. They were companions in an age that didn't always offer softness. They were quiet listeners in a city that often shouted. They were something constant, small, strange, and completely unjudging. Historians still argue whether the frog funerals were widespread or confined to eccentric elites. Records are scarce. Most took place in secret, at dusk, in private gardens, or deep in city parks where prying eyes were less likely. One account, written by a governess named Elodie, describes her employer holding a full Catholic-style mass for a frog named Ferdinand. The guests wore black. The priest said nothing. The frog lay on a satin cushion, surrounded by lilies and a single fly. They wept, she wrote, and I wept too, though I'd only known him a week. Another story, less solemn, recounts a frog's wake at a Montparnasse cafe. Attendees gave speeches, read poetry, and toasted with absinthe. Someone painted a portrait mid-ceremony. The frog's body was never actually present. Turns out it had escaped earlier that day. No one knew whether to celebrate or mourn. René leads you deeper into the cemetery's oldest section, where stones crumble and names fade into moss. They stopped burying them here when the city cracked down, he mutters. Too many letters, too much press. They said it was unhygienic. He spits, as if grief comes with rules. You believe him. Eventually, the frog burials moved indoors, into mausoleums, urns, memory boxes hidden in drawers. One woman, wealthy beyond reason, had a jeweler craft a locket containing the ashes of 6 frogs. She wore it every day. When she died, the locket was buried with her. Some people tried taxidermy, of course. You spot a few preserved frogs behind cracked glass at an antique shop later that afternoon. Frozen mid-hop, eyes lacquered over. One wears a tutu, another is posed with a violin. There's something uncanny about them, like they know you're watching, like they'd rather be anywhere else. Grief, it seems, didn't always lead to dignity, but for most, loss simply meant ritual. A folded handkerchief, a favorite lily pad, a final croak remembered over breakfast. Some even wrote eulogies. There's a small book, Croaks Remembered, filled with them. One passage reads, "You did not speak, you did not love as I loved, but you stayed, and in staying you taught me silence." You close the book. Sit with that for a moment, because behind the lace and the perfume and the strange little monocles was a very human impulse, to love something small and quiet, and when it was gone, to mourn it as if it had been a part of them, because it had. You visit an old townhouse once owned by the Comtesse d'Aubigny, famously known for hosting seasonal frog salons. When her favorite frog, Philippe, passed, she held a procession through the gardens, complete with flautists and guests dressed in green. At the end, she delivered a full speech. A guest later wrote, "It was ridiculous. It was overwrought. It was utterly perfect." Some stories say she kept Philippe's favorite stone under her pillow for years. Others say she never spoke of frogs again. In the end, the frog funerals weren't really about frogs. They were about the self. How we grieve, how we cope, how we turn the ordinary into something sacred just to make sense of the ache. You walk back through the cemetery one last time. It's quiet now. The wind carries a few leaves across the gravel. You could swear you hear a croak somewhere far off, but maybe it's just the trees. Or memory. Or both. One of the stones reads simply, "He waited for me at the pond. I'm still walking." You leave a pebble on the grave. No one sees you. You don't need to explain, because some farewells are only whispered. The fog lifts by afternoon, revealing a city that's somehow more vivid than before, as if the colors of Paris have absorbed all that absurdity, grief, and quiet love and now wear it like a second skin. You walk through the Latin Quarter, your boots echoing against the cobbles, your mind still tracing names carved into tiny gravestones. And yet, despite all you've seen, the salons, the spectacles, the satire, the sorrow, there's still one question twitching at the back of your mind like a frog under glass. Why frogs? Not cats. Not dogs. Not parrots in little top hats or turtles with spectacles. Although, to be fair, they had their moments too. Why did 19th century Parisians, so famously sophisticated, so rigid in their rituals, fall head over heels for these moist little marsh dwellers? The answer, you discover, is slipperier than a wet stone. It starts, as many French obsessions do, with symbolism. In medieval bestiaries, frogs were seen as transitional creatures, part land, part water. They were lumped into chapters with demons, saints, and other strange hybrids. To some, they symbolized resurrection. To others, impurity. The Bible was not kind to frogs. Remember plague number 2? And yet, in French folklore, frogs had a curious duality. Part nuisance, part charm. They sang before storms. They appeared in fairy tales. They hopped through peasant fields and aristocratic fountains alike. One tale, dating back to the 17th century, tells of a talking frog that gave relationship advice to a lovelorn count. The advice, tragically, was misinterpreted. Over time, frogs slid into the language. You'd hear people say, "Il a de jambes de grenouille," he has frog legs, meant as both an insult and a compliment. Slim, agile, slightly absurd. And of course, there was the infamous culinary link. Frog legs, or cuisses de grenouille, had long been a delicacy, which meant that even before the leashes and lace, frogs were already tied to both France's identity and its dinner plate. So when a few eccentric artists began parading their amphibians through the streets, it didn't feel alien. It felt oddly familiar, as if the frog had always been lurking just under the surface of Parisian culture, waiting for its moment. But why now? Historians still argue whether it was coincidence or consequence, but the 19th century was a time of deep uncertainty. The French Revolution had unseated old certainties. The Napoleonic Wars reshuffled borders and beliefs. Industrialization turned the city inside out. People were untethered. Enter the frog. Small, wordless, unjudging. A creature that could be decorated, directed, adored without ever pushing back. A blank canvas for a society desperate to feel in control again. But not everyone saw frogs as blank. Some thinkers, particularly the Romantic poets, saw frogs as the ultimate outsiders, creatures that didn't belong to either world. Not quite land, not quite water, not mammal, not fish. Their refusal to fit made them strangely admirable. In one essay, the writer Lisette Courtemanche declared, "The frog is the poet of the marsh. It sings when others sleep. It watches always and speaks only in riddles." Sure, Lisette was probably drunk, but she wasn't entirely wrong. There's a melancholy to frogs that matched the emotional tone of the time. They croaked in puddles. They watched rain fall. They were still when others ran. In a world obsessed with progress and noise, frogs represented pause. Some even believed frogs could sense emotional energy. There were salons where guests claimed their frogs would croak when the conversation grew too superficial. A natural critique, one hostess said. Another insisted her frog became agitated anytime anyone mentioned marriage. She took it as divine warning. And then there was the science. 19th century Europe was gripped by natural history fever. Specimens were collected, catalogued, pinned under glass. Frogs, easy to catch, strange to observe, and capable of some truly bizarre behaviors, became a favorite. Their metamorphosis alone fascinated people. How could something soft and boneless become a creature with lungs and legs? The frog embodied transformation, and the French, still reeling from revolutions and regime changes, were obsessed with reinvention. One scholar, Amadou Vigna, argued that the entire frog craze was a subconscious reenactment of the revolution. From swamp to salon, from anonymity to aristocracy. The frog was a stand-in for the French self, squishy, confused, but determined to wear a monocle and pretend everything was fine. Whether you buy that or not, it's hard to ignore the cultural role frogs came to play. They weren't just pets. They were metaphors, punchlines, therapists, political symbols, dinner companions, mirrors, and occasionally scapegoats. When things went wrong, when marriages collapsed, fortunes dried up, or artists flopped, there were whispers. He spent too much time with his frog. One duchess famously blamed her frog's emotional instability for her failed engagement. The frog, notably, offered no defense. And yet, the obsession never really ended. It just mellowed. Frogs became household jokes, children's toys, glass figurines. The fashion craze cooled, but the affection remained. Even today, you see ceramic frogs in Parisian windows. Frog-shaped chocolates, garden statues posed mid-leap. They never left. You think of all you've seen, the markets, the mourning, the revolutionaries in corduroy waving frogs like flags. And you realize the frog was never the point. It was always us, wanting something quiet to care for, something small enough to fit in a pocket but strange enough to spark conversation. Something ancient, alien, and yet, when wrapped in silk, oddly elegant. Maybe that's all anyone wants. Something a little weird to love. You wander now without direction, through alleys that curl like question marks and boulevards that stretch out with operatic confidence, as if daring you to keep wondering. You've asked the big question, why frogs? But now another lingers, just behind your teeth, stubborn and quiet. What happened when it all ended? Because it did, of course. All manias burn out eventually. Even the most well-dressed toad can only hold a salon crowd for so long. But how did it happen? Not with a bang. Not with a mass declaration banning amphibian couture. The end came like a gentle dusk, slow, quiet, and only obvious once the shadows had fully arrived. It started with fatigue. By the 1880s, frog content had become tired. You see it in the newspapers first. Headlines that groan with repetition, cartoons that recycle old jokes with slightly different hats. Even the famously eccentric Le Croque-Batracien, a once thriving satirical pamphlet, prints an editorial titled, perhaps we've gone too far. The public, bloated on frog narratives, begins to shrug. Fashion houses that once showcased amphibian lines now quietly remove them from catalogs. One seamstress, once lauded for her frog corsets, turns to dogs and never looks back. Vendors at the once vibrant Marque Patrician start closing earlier. The perfumer rebrands, now selling scents for moths. His new sign says, almost bitterly, the frogs, of course, don't care. They never asked for monocles. They never needed lavender-soaked moss beds or tiny shoehorns. And as the attention fades, many return to quieter lives. Ponds, tanks, balconies. A few are released back into the countryside, which feels noble, if slightly misplaced. Urban frogs often fare poorly in the wild. They expect applause after every leap. You pass a former frog cafe, now converted into a bookstore. The lily pad pillows are gone, but the croak-proof carpeting remains. A faded sign still hangs on the door. We reserve the right to refuse service to unaccompanied amphibians. No one's bothered to take it down. Historians still argue whether the collapse of frog mania was cultural or economic. Some blame the rise of new fads, canary orchestras, bat-shaped bonnets, the brief but fiery snail topiary movement of 1886. Others cite the encroachment of realism in art and literature. People grew tired of fantasy. They wanted grit. Grit didn't croak. A few critics point to a more personal reason: shame. Because when you've cried at a frog funeral, spent a month's wages on amphibian leisurewear, and let a toad decide your dinner guests, there comes a moment of reckoning. A moment where you look into the eyes of a creature perched on a velvet cushion and think, perhaps this has gone sideways. Paris, in its very essence, is a city obsessed with reinvention. And reinvention always demands forgetting. So the frogs were slowly edited out. You visit an old portrait gallery near Rue de Lille, where paintings once featured frogs in cameos and background corners. Now they're gone, painted over or removed during restoration. A toad that once lounged on a duchess's lap has been replaced with a fan. A frog wearing epaulets is now just empty chair. You ask the curator. He shrugs. We had complaints. Said it felt undignified. You raise an eyebrow. For the duchess or the frog? He doesn't answer. Even literature shifted. Once brimming with amphibian poetry and metaphor, the new wave of realist authors turned their backs on the pond. Frogs became rural cliches, punchlines in farming memoirs. The great poet Theodore Lassalle, once known for his collection Marshlight Sonatas, abandoned verse entirely and began writing gruff detective novels. No frogs in sight. In some cases, the erasure was active. You discover rumors of a secret society, Les Nenuphobes, dedicated to purging Paris of residual amphibian influence. Their motto, less croak, more clarity. You're not sure they were real, but part of you wants them to be, if only for the image of candlelit meetings where people whisper, it's in the upholstery. We must act. And yet, despite this systematic forgetting, echoes remained. You spotted in architecture, frog-shaped waterspouts on apartment balconies, pond mosaics hidden beneath stairwells, door knockers with webbed toes. Most people don't notice, but once you know what to look for, the city hums with ghosts. One night, you attend a lecture at a small university on the cultural residue of amphibian affection in post-imperial France. It's sparsely attended. The professor clicks through blurry slides. One shows a diary entry. She left me, took the frog. He wore the scarf I knitted until the end. No one laughs, because here, in this fading echo of a once roaring craze, the absurd gives way to something tender. The people who grieved frogs did so earnestly. The ones who trained them, walked them, wrote about them, yes, they were ridiculous. But they were also trying to love, to nurture, to connect, even if it was with something that would never say thank you, or stay. You walk home under a sky that's lost its fog. The moon hangs like a soft eye, watching. You pass a man on a bench, reading aloud from a book. No one sits beside him, but at his feet, half hidden in the shadow, is a small green frog, listening, Maybe. The mania is gone. The market's closed. The monogrammed bowls tucked away in attic trunks. But some frogs stayed. And some people never stopped waiting for them to croak. By now, your pace has slowed. Not from exhaustion exactly, but from something softer, a kind of dreamy weight like you're walking through someone else's memory. Paris looks different now. Not because it's changed, but because you have. Every gargoyle seems vaguely amphibious. Every ripple in a puddle feels like a possible leap. And now, as we near the end of this strange, slippery journey, we reach the final ripple, the last gasp of Paris's frog obsession. Its legacy. Because though the ribbons have faded and the frog salons fallen silent, the story didn't simply vanish. It evolved. Like the frog itself, it molted. You find yourself at a small museum exhibit tucked in the Marais, barely advertised and dimly lit. Its title, printed in flaking gold leaf, Le Mode Grenouille, a century of amphibian affection. Inside, it smells like dust and forgotten laughter. Glass cases display tiny top hats, spats, and velvet cravats sized for frogs. A wall is covered in newspaper clippings, some earnest, others absurd. In one yellowed print, a headline blares, "Frog wins heart of Countess, loses hat in the process." There's even a reconstructed leash, the infamous silk thread and silver buckle variety. It's so delicate it looks like it might dissolve if you breathe too hard. You don't. Then there are the journals, private, intimate, written by Parisians who had truly loved their frogs. Some are heartbreaking. One reads, "He watched me cry every day for a year, and when I laughed again, he didn't ask why." There's also a strange, beautiful painting in one corner. A woman on a balcony at dusk, cupping a frog in her hands like it's made of starlight. No plaque, no artist, no date, but it steals your breath a little. The museum is quiet. Most days, it gets only a handful of visitors, historians, curiosity seekers, and the occasional child who's dragged their parent in with wild tales of talking toads. You smile, because that child might be closer to the truth than they know. Because here's the thing, the frogs never left Paris. Not really. They just slipped beneath the surface, waiting, reappearing here and there in culture, art, and the occasional viral TikTok, yes, even now. Designers still sneak frog motifs into couture. Poets reference them without explanation. Street artists stencil their silhouettes onto alley walls. It's subtle, fleeting, but it's there. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, someone in this city still leaves a saucer of water on their windowsill, just in case. Historians still argue whether the whole thing was madness or metaphor, a cultural fever dream, a citywide midlife crisis with extra webbing. But maybe that's missing the point, because every generation finds its own frog. Sometimes it's a fad, sometimes a symbol, sometimes a literal amphibian wearing a tiny beret. But always, it's about that longing to connect with something other. Something that doesn't speak, but listens. That doesn't ask, but stays. The legacy of Paris's frog craze isn't just in the archives or the trinkets. It's in the way we love ridiculous things. The way we make room for the silly, the soft, the silent. The way we dare to put a leash on a frog and believe, for a moment, that we're both going somewhere together. You step outside. The sky has turned to velvet. There's a hush over the street. Somewhere, a street lamp flickers. And there, just barely, you spot it. A frog. Real or statue, you're not sure. It sits on a stoop like it's guarding something important. Maybe it is. You walk on, smiling. Because now you know the truth. The frogs weren't fashion. They weren't rebellion. They weren't even companions, really. They were permission. Permission to be ridiculous. To be tender, to believe, against all reason, that even the strangest creatures deserve a little ceremony. And sometimes, so do you. So now, as you settle back into bed, head against your pillow, limbs sinking into the gentle gravity of sleep, let the images soften. Let the tiny boots and velvet leashes blur into memory, like ink bleeding across old paper. The streets of Paris fade to fog once more. The river flows silently. The little market stalls shutter themselves with a sigh. Somewhere, tucked beneath a window box or curled beside a boot scraper, a frog breathes slowly in the dark. No crowds, no applause, just the quiet rhythm of something that has always been here. And maybe, just maybe, still is. You feel your own breath slow. Your limbs grow heavy. That lovely kind of heavy that says it's okay to rest now. That says you've wandered long enough tonight, through lace and laughter and loss. Let your thoughts ripple outward like pond water in the dark. Let the absurdities wash over you one last time. The frog in a hat, the tiny funeral, the scholar arguing passionately about frog-based metaphors. Smile just a little. It's all ridiculous. And that's why it matters. You don't need to understand it fully. You just need to know. Someone once loved a frog so much, they wrote poems about his silence. And someone else, maybe you, listened. So close your eyes. Let the moonlight filter through your curtains like soft silver threads. Let the fan hum like a faraway croak. Let the world go on without you for a while, because the frogs have it handled. Good night.